Hi, everybody. Welcome to our first lecture. This is chapter one. Uh, you guys want to have a pen and paper or pencil and paper, whatever is handy for you guys to write down with. Give you guys a little tip here at the start. Sometimes in my lecture notes, there'll be quite a bit of text, dense area. But I always try to help you guys out by highlighting and emphasizing what is the most important takeaway. Sometimes you might see a block of text and kind of freak out, like, oh man, how in the world am I going to take the time to write all that down? Usually the case, you don't have to write it all down. You definitely want to know larger context, what's taking place. But the good news is primarily focus on what I highlight for you or what I verbally tell you is really important for you guys to write down. That'll make it a little more manageable so we can have both the sweet spot of making it manageable for you guys to recall what's critical for the exam and more important, the exam just for knowledge in general, the expansion of your understanding of the topic. And simultaneously, the kind of deeper context and more kind of granular level analysis of it, not getting lost in all the detail, making it more easy to process it. So hopefully it'll be in that sweet spot when I let you guys know what's most important. All right. So with all that, welcome to our first lecture. And this is chapter one, the Asian American experience, an overview of the history, language, ideologies of the Asian American experience. So there in front of you, you can see Nathan Chin, who recently won the gold medal in Beijing. As you guys, maybe you saw, maybe you didn't. If you haven't, I recommend to you guys. YouTube's fabulous for this. But he's a fantastic ice skater. He had a lot of stiff competition, but I'm biased, but I think clearly he's the best in the world. So along with him, there on the right, you have Min Jin Lee, who is an acclaimed author. Maybe some of you have come across her bestseller, Pachinko, about the Korean minority community living in Japan, what that means to be a Korean community living in Japan. It's a fabulous novel. There's a lot that the typical American public is not aware of what it's like to be a minority, in this case, of one Asian group, in this case, a Korean group, living in Japan, another Asian nation. It's really helpful to give us more of a broad perspective. As Americans, we tend to be very focused on what's happening here in America. Now, we live here, so that's partially natural, but it also limits our perspective of what's going on in the world, and even, frankly, to understand ourselves more accurately and more of a global perspective of what's taking place. So I recommend her book to you guys. We'll talk about her probably a little bit later. I'll just FYI, my wife is Korean, so it's kind of a connected to me, be familiar with this topic. But Min Jin Lee, great author. Some more Asian Americans of note currently. Yo-Yo Ma, if you guys like classical music, probably you're already very well aware of him. He's a musical genius, fantastic musician. The cello is high on my personal list of favorite classical music instruments, although the violin is good too, many others. But he's a brilliant musician, world-renowned musician. Of course, he's a Chinese American. But if I didn't mention Nathan Chen, Chinese American, Min Jin Lee, Korean American. And for those of you who like, The Office and Parks and Rec, a whole series of things, there's Mindy Kaling, and she is an Indian American actress, comedian, talent. Now, on the one hand, we have these brilliant artists, thinkers, performers, writers, athletes from the Asian American community contributing to our entire nation. Simultaneously, as you guys know, the last 2 years of the pandemic, there's been a steady stream of racially motivated attack upon Asian Americans. Some of these probably are from people who, besides being obviously morally compromised, probably mentally ill, but others of them maybe not mentally ill, just deeply misinformed, angry, and for many of them there'd be a racist edge to it as well too. This has happened steadily. In fact, even today I was getting ready for this lecture, I saw a Chinese American performer in a musical in New York City was attacked on the way to the musical last night. So there's a steady stream of this, and this taps into an old aspect of America, which is to view Asians as another, not like us, not part of us, but as something different, something foreign, something threatening. And the pandemic tragically has brought out some of those words kind of ghost. Maybe they're not ghost, not they're gone, but a resonance of what happened earlier in history in a much broader way, but still is taking place today. And I think today, thank God, most Americans are appalled by such attacks and reject them. But the fact that it still occurs in the first place lets you know that some of this residue of rejection, misunderstanding, and frankly just racism remains sadly present in contemporary America. And that's one of the reasons, by the way, why you guys are in this class. There's many reasons, but that's one of them. In response, by the way, to the stress the Asian American community has been under the last several years, especially with the pandemic and the coronavirus and arguments about its origin, and there's been a whole series of Asian American activists, writers, thinkers, artists, athletes, others who have spoken up and given voice to the Asian American community. This artwork you see above you by Amanda, and boy, I'm not sure I'm going to try her last name because I want to do respect to her, and I need to go on YouTube and learn her last name. But she's a very talented artist. You see that her work there. See, "We Are America Too," "Protect Our Elders," and "We Belong Here." The reference "Protect Our Elders," by the way, refers to sadly a lot of Asian Americans who've been attacked. Many of them have been elderly in Chinatowns in Oakland and New York, other places. Although it's not just limited to age, as you guys know too. But a number of the victims have been elderly Asian American men and women. And then right to the left, they say "We are more." And I don't know if you guys can see that. Maybe I can zoom in a little bit. So you can see there, maybe it's a little better. "We are more than your Asian sidekick, the confused foreigner, the future doctor, your submissive plaything, the helpless refugee, the dragon lady, the straight A student, the computer hacker, the martial arts master, the smucky girl with dyed hair, the quiet kid. I'm reading it too. The quiet kid, the dependable worker, the nail lady, the tiger mom." So yeah, the Asian American community is incredibly diverse. So don't put us into a neat little box based on perceptions. There's a dragon dance there in a Chinese American New Year ceremony there in Washington, D.C. back in 2020. And I've been using terms since this lecture started. We need to define that term and go into its origin a little bit. And that is, what does it mean by the term Asian Americans? Now, on the face of it, maybe it's kind of obvious what we mean by that, but there is more to that story. So the term Asian Americans is a fairly recent term. If you go back early American history, that term did not exist. It's a relatively, when I say relatively, it's a late 1960s creation. Prior to that, you'd use umbrella terms like Orientals, or maybe refer to the nation of origin. We'll go into later, not in this lecture, but we'll go into later more detail of why the term Oriental is problematic and why that's gone away, largely so. Asian Americans, though, being a recent term, the term of choice today by the Asian American community, it's an umbrella term, by the way, as you guys know, refers to an ancestral, cultural, or racial link to Asia. And specifically, most commonly, that would be East Asia, South Asia, or Southeast Asia. And I'll show you a map here in a minute what I'm talking about specifically. But it also, frankly, could include people from Central Asia and West Asia. Now, we need to look at a world map, see what we're talking about here. So let me scroll down. I'll go back up because I know we're not done with that. But so East Asia is what you guys see here in yellow. East Asia would be, of course, China above all, but the Korean Peninsula, which you see right here, and Japan, and would include Taiwan. East Asia, I suppose, is the most prominent of the Asian American voices. That's because the Chinese were the first immigrant community from Asia and the United States that made its first major impact. So when we think of Asian Americans, oftentimes spring to mind would refer to East Asians. But the umbrella term includes much more than that, and that's important to be aware of that. So then you see Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia would include what today would be, this would be Myanmar, or we used to use in Burma, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines, and other nations here as well too, Papua New Guinea, etc. All this is considered Southeast Asia. And then South Asia would be the Indian subcontinent, which today would include Pakistan, Afghanistan, India, Nepal, Bangladesh, and Bhutan would all be considered part of South Asia. Now, so when you say Asian Americans, most commonly we're referring to these regions right here, which would be East Asia, Southeast Asia, and South Asia. But it could also include, because we need to be careful with the terminology here, it could also include Central Asia. These are the former Soviet republics right here, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, etc. It could also refer to West Asia, which more commonly we use the term the Middle Eastern. They're kind of a stride kind of those terms, because they probably both of those will work, because obviously it's a Middle Eastern culture predominantly in this region right here, but historically it was also considered in a more generalized sense part of Asia. Now, I'm going to be careful because, again, I think in our parlance, Asian American tends to refer to predominantly these regions right here, but it is all-inclusive terms and could include, depends how they choose to self-identify, could also include people from the Middle East. That also has its own identity, as you guys know, too, and its own set of issues and concerns. But that's just a general overview. Now, North Asia usually is not, let's really include that. We would say it would be Russia, or at least the eastern portion of Russia. And for the sake of our purposes, I think most Asian Americans would not include probably Russia in the term Asian Americans. Although, it's a little complicated again because there are actually East Asian ethnic minorities and Central Asian ethnic minorities inside Russia. So if they had immigrated to the United States, in the eyes of the general American public, they could appear, for lack of a term, vaguely Asian, and they would be considered part of the Asian American experience. So again, it's an umbrella term that covers really vast and very diverse range of people in the group. Okay, so let's go back up here a little bit. So now, I'm not going to drill down too deep into this, but it depends how you define them. I just showed you how broad really the umbrella term is. So some historians argue 24 distinct groups, and that's the historian we're using for our class, Erica Lee, in her Making of Asian America. She argues 24 distinct groups. Madeline Sue argues that there's 40 distinct groups, and others argue up to 50 distinct ethnic groups, all of which can claim the part umbrella status as Asian American. Probably just depends, frankly, what is your definition, obviously, being national, language, cultural groupings. Okay. So, as you guys know, Asian American, the term is an experience. Both the term and experience is very, very diverse. It's far more diverse than probably most of us with a casual idea realizes how diverse that means. It applies to many people. The immigration status part of that, generational status, how long they've been in America, the class position, the religion, the gender. There's many factors that add complexity and nuance in what it means to be Asian American. You have Asian Americans who have been in the United States from the 1830s, much longer than many European immigrants have been here. So, and then some Asian immigrants came recently, right? So there's a huge gradation even within the Asian American community, not to mention, obviously, the complexity of their background. So further complexity comes from varying traditional and contemporary American perceptions of the region of origins that show in color how each group is perceived by the majority of American culture. We'll get into that in much more detail in class, but because a typical American, unless, again, they have a contact with Asia themselves, or have close Asian friends or acquaintances, coworkers, probably does not have a real strong understanding of Asia in general, and especially a particular nation of origin or people of origin in particular. So that could be a challenge, and we're going to talk about that extensively in this class. Finally, additionally, due to our increasingly pluralistic culture, blending of families, of course, is occurring. So even the term Asian American gets a little bit complicated because a lot of us have blended identities, as you guys know. America is increasingly moving in that direction, so it gets more complex. So a person, depending on their parentage and their ancestry, could have Asian American, African American, Caucasian American, Latino American. You guys know it can get very diverse, and you could still be in part Asian American. So, yes. So, and additionally, one more thing I want to add into it, which I did not mention prior to the umbrella term, the term Asian American Pacific Islander, or AAPI, is also frequently used, and that includes all the Pacific Islands. Now, I did not include that in my map right here, in the map right here. That also can be included in the conversation too. And that's also a very diverse range of cultures and peoples too when you include Pacific Islander community as well. Whew, all right. So speaking of broad diversity, let me give you some examples of that from our contemporary culture. So Suni Lee, for example, won the gold medal in gymnastics this past summer, is Hmong American. Bruno Mars, maybe a surprise to many of you, maybe you guys know this, is partly Filipino American. Now, by the way, he has lots of different racial nation origins in his background. So Filipino American is just one of them. But that is, so part of him is, and again, I don't get too deep, but that is Asian American. So part of his ancestry is Asian American. Of course, our Vice President, Kamala Harris, the 49th Vice President of the United States, is, as you guys know, mixed, and she is part Indian American. She's also part Afro-American, too. And then Tiger Woods, you guys know, his mom is Vietnamese, so and his father is African-American or black. So again, he has a mixed legacy, mixed parentage. So when he identifies on the census, he's going to be checking multiple boxes, which a lot of us are going to be increasingly doing. Not just the complexity of America, and especially of the Asian and very diverse Asian American community. All right. Now, this class is a combination of two things. We're going to see how this fits together. I'm going to try hard to make it happen. So I'm an historian. That's my training. That's my outlook. But this class is actually both. It's both a history class. As you guys know, it's History 20. It's also Ethnic Studies 20. Ethnic Studies professors are going to have a different education lens in which they look at things. Both historians and ethnic studies professors, both of them would have some general similar ways to look at things, but there's also going to be some differences. And so this class, we're going to try to have the best of both worlds in there, and I'm going to do my best to try to make that happen. So you can keep your fingers crossed, but I will do my best to make that happen. So let me give you just a very brief, that's the first lecture, overall lectures to kind of get the ground laid out for what's going to happen in our class, and give you guys kind of an introduction to a complex, wonderful, rich topic, which is the Asian experience in America. And so part of that is obviously following the history of Asian Americans. So we're going to start from the first arrival of Asian immigrants to America, or the Americas, and the experiences, right, difficulties they experienced in those early days, overt racism, exclusion, sometimes outright violence, and obstacles at one level of another. Simultaneously, you have tremendous resilience, contribution to what America becomes. The agency of the Chinese, the Japanese, many others that came in those early years, the Filipinos who began to transform America through their genius, through their work, through their brilliance, through resilience, for their call for inclusion in the American identity, and altering the American identity with the richness they bring, the talent they bring, the intelligence they bring to the nation at large. So some examples of that you see there, and these are some Chinese railroad workers there, which is the first, I say, large-scale immigration to the United States, of course, is going to be initially to the Chinese community, immigrants coming to work on the railroad. You'll see the backlash, the very strong racial backlash here on the West Coast, and California in particular toward that, which we'll get into. And as the years roll by, as more Asian Americans arrive, the Japanese Americans, you have further examples of wonderful things and also sadness and terrible errors in our nation and inability to see beyond ourselves and majoritarian culture. In this case, the Japanese American internment. You see that image on the left, you see a U.S. soldier, and he's helpful. He's carrying that young Japanese boy or girl, I think it's a boy, and helping that family out as they're being removed from their forcibly moved by the U.S. government to the Japanese American internment into confinement. I love that picture because that picture says so many things. On the one hand, the soldier is recognizing common humanity. He's helping. He sees this Japanese American mother struggling with her kids, and he's going to help out. So he's carrying one of them. It's great. It's common humanity. I don't know whether he's a dad himself, or maybe he's a young man, probably, maybe not a dad, but sees his family struggling, wants to help out, so carries one of the kids. That's great. But you're carrying them into confinement. I'm not putting it all on that soldier. I'm saying what the U.S. government, society at large has done. This gross denial of civil liberties and rights of the Japanese American community in World War II. It's a dark moment for us. And then in more recent times, that's a photograph of Amy Tan, who, especially back in the 90s, but still today, became a major voice in the Asian American community through her literature, her books, and through an important movie that came out in 1993 called The Joy Luck Club. Perhaps some of you guys have seen The Joy Luck Club. Maybe some of you have even read her book. She's written many other books too, but Joy Luck Club is probably the most impactful, giving voice to both the Chinese immigrant experience in America, but also connecting it to generational experience in China and origin. And you have in her book a generation of young Chinese Americanized women trying to understand their Chinese-born immigrant mothers, and that those two different worlds, and trying to, what does it mean to be a son of an immigrant, and try to understand like where they come from, what was their origin story, their culture, in many cases their trauma they went through in the case of these Chinese ladies in the immigration in the United States, and that story. And that was good for Americans. A lot of Americans, prior to that book coming out, especially I say the general public, because that movie did quite well in the theaters, that was a revelation for many Americans, getting them greater insight into the Asian American and then Asian experience. A couple more examples, again, what we talk about in history class of both the good and the bad and the ugly. We have I.M. Pei, which is a brilliant Chinese American, renowned architect, one of the giants of the 20th century in architecture. Probably his most iconic, famous architectural creation would be his glass pyramid there, which is right in the middle of the Louvre there in Paris. The Louvre, that magnificent, world-class former palace, but today museum, and installing this entrance location into the museum complex through this glass pyramid. By the way, when that first came out, it was very controversial because you have this kind of neoclassical French mansion palace, and then you put this very new, modern glass pyramid right into the courtyard. And so at first it generated a lot of controversy, but today it's considered a masterpiece. And then you have Christy Yamaguchi, who won the gold medal in figure skating in 1992. And her advocacy for the Asian American community, and again, her athletic brilliance and artistry, winning the gold medal for the United States back in 1992. That's just a small sampling. We'll get to much more detail. Now, that's the history side. Now, we're going to, I say switch, but in a sense, a little bit, I want to give you guys a little background to ethnic studies and their perspective, their lens looking at Asian Americans. Now, the ethnic studies lens is a bit more focused. It'll do what historians do too, but ethnic studies is a response to the difficulty, the trauma, the discrimination, the othering that the Asian American experience, Asian American community has experienced inside the United States. So the specific field of ethnic studies for Asian Americans is specifically focused on correcting and giving primacy of voice to the Asian American community instead of relying on general majoritarian white perceptions or Latino or Black perceptions of the Asian community, that the Asian American community is able to define themselves, they have voice for themselves, so we have a full understanding of their humanity, their role, their voice in America. And ethnic studies is focused on highlighting that difficult journey, in some ways that tragic journey, that dehumanizing journey, but also the agency of the Asian American community battling for full inclusion, full understanding of their humanity and the American experience. And so in that context, it's covering the history, but it tends to be a bit more specific, focusing on that theme. So with that background, let me give you examples of that. So the lens in which the ethnic studies community would look at the Asian American experience, they're especially going to focus on those key issues of not being seen clearly and not having voice and your full humanity recognized, which, by the way, historians, of course, do that too. So example of that would be the term subaltern speaking, and let me highlight this for you guys so you guys will know this. Subaltern speaking, that's a subaltern, by the way, to find it for you. Subaltern means traditionally that was a junior British military officer, oftentimes in India, and that's what it's really origin to be in India, in the British colonial empire. He's a junior officer, so he's subordinate to the higher level officers. Now, the subordinate part of that means this junior officer may not himself be actually British. He could be Indian. So he could be Indian in the British military, so he's serving the British military as part of a colonial force that is occupying India. You can see what a complicated situation that would be, and him being likely very conflicted. For example, if you are part of the British unit in the British Army, but you are ethnically, racially identify as Indian, so you are working for the British Empire, but the British Empire has colonized your homeland. You can see where that gets kind of complicated for that person as they see things. The British military probably gives you a good job. That's probably why you're doing it. It gives you some pride and status in your community. The British control things anyways. They didn't ask the Indian community. That's okay. Maybe you feel like the best job you can get as a young man. That may be all true. And by pride and professionalism in the British military. The British military is quite good. So you have all that as well too. Professionalism, some status, some pay for your family. It's all true. But also, you're never going to raise to a high level in the British military as someone ethnically of Indian stock. So your status as a junior officer, as high as you're ever going to get. So what all that means is, in the context of this, is instead of listening to the British colonial overlords in India, their perceptions of India, Indian culture, Indian values, Indian peoples, to allow people who are Indian, who can be a part of the system, but who are Indian, and they understand on a much deeper level what it means to be Indian, part of this colonial occupation of their lands. And that's what I mean by subaltern speaking. So this you guys want to write down. So take a minute here, write this down. Giving agency inclusion to marginalized voices, not often heard in the majority culture-dominated public sphere. So that's what ethnic studies is doing, is to focus instead of what does the majority say, what's their perceptions of the experience. No, to give above all agency and voice to the Asian American community. Now, historians doing their job properly are going to be doing that too, so that's not different in a sense. But just ethnic studies is going to be laser focused on that particular voice. Now, if you're wondering who the images are right there, let me scroll down so you can see them a little better. Antonio Grasmisi, don't quote me on his pronunciation, is the one who coined the term the subaltern. Now, he's Italian Marxist journalist thinker, but he's looking at what does it mean to be a native in an imperial colony. And that's oftentimes how ethnic studies professors and scholars will look at the status of Asian Americans, or other groups too for that matter. But in this case, our context of our class, Asian Americans in Asian American history. Now, that gentleman in the middle, you don't need to write his name down. His name is Houston Stuart Chamberlain. He's a British-German philosopher. My only point mentioning him is he's an example of what an ethnic studies scholar would point to as someone who is the exact opposite of who we want to trust when their perception of things. So, Chamberlain wrote works extensively focused on German ethno-nationalism, anti-Semitism, social Darwinism, and scientific racism. By the way, not criticizing them, propounding those theories that the Germanic race, that's a kind of mythological aspect to it, but the Germanic race is superior, more moral, more creative, more talented, better. Other races are racially, scientifically, inferior to the Germanic race. Not surprised that stuff is toxic. It's not scientifically true. But his voice is very influential in that time period, and his views of these issues go on to influence the Nazi Party in general, Adolf Hitler in particular, especially the views on race. Now, my point of mentioning him is he's part of majority culture in Germany, and his ideas on other races, other groups, whether it's Jews or Africans, Asians, etc., are viewed as the normal, the natural, the correct for many within German society, in a very dark example, of course, ultimately with Hitler himself and Nazi Germany, this very racialized hierarchy of the good races and bad races that Chamberlain lays out in his writing. So in ethnic studies context, being aware of that being out in the majority culture, ethnic studies say that's exactly what we're battling against. We're going to focus on refuting that insanity, but equally giving voice to that marginalized group that has not had a voice prior to that. And that's why I included John Okada's No No Boy. That book came out in 1957. You guys see that book right here. And that book is focused on the experience of a young Japanese-American man in the aftermath of the Japanese-American internment, the trauma of that psychologically, for those who knows, and what's life emerging out of that in the early years following World War II. By the way, not surprisingly, that's not an easy journey, to say the least. We'll get into much more of that later on in the semester. But the point of that is that book is today considered a classic, coming out in 1957. It's one of the early works that really viscerally, accurately, personally examines what's it like to be an Asian American in America that oftentimes does not understand you, perhaps judges you without knowing anything about you, knows little to nothing about your culture, and what many of them do know is negative and views it as inferior, and yet he's an American. So how do you navigate that? How do you cope with that psychologically, personally, economically? How do you cope with all that? And John Okada's book, No No Boy, is giving voice to what that experience is like. Okay. I think you don't need to write all this down, although this would be helpful to you guys. Actually, I take that back. I'll give you guys a minute here. Let me highlight that for you. The subaltern, that's a belief that the narrative and status of minority people need to be given that full voice that I explained, realizing that oftentimes they've been oppressed by the majority culture that perhaps does not understand them, does not have time to understand them, or dismisses them, or views them with some kind of negative racial cultural lens. All right. So specifically, where the origin of the Asian American studies come from, because this class is built on that. So where does this come from? Again, this is a relatively recent thing. So get your highlighter out, or I guess your pen and pencil ready. So what's the origin of this? And this will take us into the late 60s, into the early 70s. And right there, the photograph you guys see in front of you shows a large contingent of Asian Americans at a peace rally for the Vietnam War. This would be in L.A., in Little Tokyo in L.A., and this is from 1970. If you see there in the background of that photograph, you'll say Asia for Asians, Stop Genocide, Peace Now, other signs there. And then that fervent of the civil rights movement of the mid-60s, late 60s is going to be the environment in which the Asian American community as a collective group is born. Now, of course, they already existed, but they did not oftentimes see themselves as a collective group with a common cause. And that's going to change. Now, of course, people within the Asian American community, again, we're using a modern term, but we're using that umbrella term because it works well, had always been fighting for their rights. You go back into the first Chinese to immigrate to the United States, and very quickly they begin to fight for their rights, for inclusion of full humanity, for inclusion in the American community, and for respect to human beings. So that's not new. That had been going on the entire time, both the Chinese American community, the Japanese American community, Filipino American community, Korean American community, etc. That's not new. But what is new is prior to this, typically most Asian American groups, again, they do not view themselves historically in early American history as Asian American. They viewed themselves as Chinese living in America, or perhaps Chinese American, or Japanese living in America, or perhaps Japanese American. That's how they viewed themselves. They, for the most part, did not have that kind of umbrella concept. We're all in the same boat. We're all Asian Americans. Now, some individuals may have felt that way, but there's no larger movement. It's much more of an individual identifying with a nation of origin, which, by the way, makes complete sense. And we'll get to this much more detail in the next couple of lectures, but Asia is very diverse. If you go to Asia, the Asian nations don't all hold hands and say, we're all Asians, isn't that great? No, the Europeans don't do that. The Asians don't do that. The African nations and peoples, the American people don't do that. Polynesian, everyone's very proud of your nation, your culture. Oftentimes there's deep local rivalries, disconnects, and so that strong, naturally nation of origin identity remains very strongly in the hearts of many of these Asian American communities. So again, they perceive themselves as Chinese or Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans. On the whole, they not see themselves as, again, an umbrella term Asian American. But that's going to change. So in the ferment of the 1960s and getting into the late 1960s, there's growing frustration among some activists, both in the Black community, in the Latino community, the Native American community, and in the Asian American community, that while King's nonviolent movement had done great good in America, but there's growing frustration with the pace of change. And there's a strong movement, especially among student activists at universities, for a more rapid move to complete equality. And that's going to require a more revolutionary, more aggressive stance than perhaps what they saw at the King's movement. Now, again, the Asian American community is very diverse. So we're talking about a smaller core of Asian American activists on college campuses, Berkeley, UCLA, CSU, San Francisco, etc., who are very active and are part of the civil rights movement, feel very empowered by that, excited by that, and also simultaneously they're tired of the abuse of the Asian American community and see this this new energy, militancy coming out of the late 1960s as a chance for them, for their experience to be recognized as fully American experience and have their voice there. And that's where it pick up. So for highlighting here, let me show you guys. So right here. So in the late 1960s, militant civil rights movements, Black Power, Black Panther, anti-Vietnam War movement, and various leftist, Marxist, socialist critics of Western traditional capitalism, all those are kind of combining, looking for a radical major change. Let me highlight that for you guys. So amid that ferment, again, that maybe exhaustion and anger and pain of being a minority in the United States that perhaps does not understand you, not willing to take the time to get to know you, certainly it had a long history of racial discrimination and abuse that had taken place for all these minority communities, and all those combining into this energy of this movement taking place in college campuses in the late 1960s. So out of that, a number of Asian American activists, particularly, I want you to know him, Yuji Ichioka, and my apologies to him again. In this class, I'll always do my best at pronunciation names, but just FYI, and by the way, my wife being Korean, if you're not familiar with that language, and if you don't hear it repeat often, you might stumble over it. So just from the get-go, I need to mention I'll do my best with all these names, but apologies because some of them probably are not correct. When I get a better pronunciation, I will correct that. So, but I will do my best. So please grant me some grace as I'm doing that. When it comes to Korean names, I'm pretty good because I've lived in Korea for a while. But when it comes to other nations' names, I'll try my best, but it's going to be a struggle. I'll be careful with that. Sometimes people naturally everyone wants their name pronounced correctly. Everybody does. But that can get a bit complex. Now, complex not meaning correctly is when you hear it to be able to do it. But if you read it in print and not heard it verbally, that's a bigger ask, especially because of the tremendous diversity we have, within names within the United States, which is one of part of our diversity. But it's also a challenge. So I'm just letting you know I will do my very best. All right. So Yuji Ichioka and his partner, Emmett G., both of them strong Asian American activists, part of the student movement. And there we are. Let me scroll down a little bit here. Both of them were graduate students at UC Berkeley in the East Asian Studies Department. Both of them are very politically active, very politically engaged, and deeply concerned for the Asian American community. And excited, inspired by the Black Power movement, anti-war movement, was taking place in Vietnam on the news on a nightly basis, the treatment of Asian Americans in general, decide something fundamentally has to change. And both of them create what is known as the Asian American Political Alliance, and you guys want to know that. So take a minute, highlight that. And that was created in Berkeley in May 1968. Now, what is the significance of this is really probably the first umbrella organization that views them as speaking for all Asian Americans, instead of exclusively for, say, Chinese Americans or Japanese Americans. The goal of Yuji Ichioka is for all Asian Americans to have a political voice, a political say in this combined group, and pool all their efforts together to bring about change in America. In this case, revolutionary change in America in its treatment and perceptions of the Asian community here in America. So, to go to the three primary goals, you see the first one is to bring all Asian Americans into a political group regardless of different ethnic and national origins. That's big and that's new. Additionally, as Erica Lee, a historian, explains, the Asian American Political Alliance critiqued the United States as a racist, imperialistic, exploitative society. The AAP rejected the perception of Asian Americans as a successful minority, instead argued Asian American communities often been exploited and oppressed minority struggling within the racist majority American population. Now, you can see right here, their perception is rejecting kind of the more feel-good narrative that that the Asian community, in this case, in the late 60s, 1970s, is doing quite well. And they're saying, yeah, maybe some individuals are, but as a community, there's vast improvements take place in our condition inside the United States. I mean, if you view the United States as a rough environment, a deeply unfair environment, and moral environment for the Asian community that lives here. Additionally, the AAP called for close cooperation with other third world peoples. So they saw, like, we have a similar struggle with the Black community, the Latino community, the Native American community, any other people, both inside the United States, but also around the world, frankly, who are struggling on some form of what they saw was colonialism, racist, imperialism, all of which they saw is having the same common linkage, and were natural allies with all these groups. Now, in its early years, AAP is not, again, it's not, in a sense, a big organization. You don't have tens of thousands of Asian Americans of all stripes signing up for this organization. That's not really its impact at the moment. It's a frankly, much smaller group. It's an activist group. But their impact is going to be big despite the relatively small numbers. Now, in that same time period, there's what's called the Third World Liberation Front. Now, the context of them, by the way, let me highlight this for you guys because you want to know this for the exam. So take a minute, write this down. Third World Liberation Front demands creation of ethnic studies. So, again, that's really a coalition of African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, Native Americans, activists who believe they have a common cause, which is our communities are not accurately represented in higher education in the United States. If you say we're an Asian American and you want to study Asian American history, any of our universities, that means any of them, and say 1968, you can't. Now, you can go there and study U.S. history, and maybe you could drill down a little bit, the right phrase, a little bit into the Asian experience in America, but even that would be quite limited. But if you want to have a class dedicated to explicitly to the Asian American experience, they did not exist. And obviously, nor do they for the Black community either, for the most part. Unless you were in a Black institution of higher learning, they would exist there. For example, like Howard University or something, they would exist there, or Fisk, or Atlanta University, which are traditionally Black institutions, you could say it. But in a typical white institution, don't hold your breath to be able to take any of these specialized classes because they did not exist. So if you want to know a more accurate, detailed look at any of these minority experiences in America, for the most part, you could maybe do some self-study, but you're not going to be able to take a university class on those topics during this era. And so the Third World Liberation Front is demanding the creation of ethnic studies departments at universities, initially in Berkeley and CSU San Francisco. Now, there was quite a bit of resistance to that, and so that leads to a very long strike. And that's part of what you see in that march right there. It's from 1969, showing Asian American activists at University of California, LA, protesting. That's one of the Black student leaders there, part of that larger Third World Liberation Front, protesting, demanding the creation of ethnic studies classes. I think that's probably UC Berkeley, although it could be San Francisco, but I think that's Berkeley demanding this. So again, Yuji Ichoka and Emma G, both of them are part of this. Both of them are joining with Third World Liberation Front, demanding and striking, not just them, other Asian Americans join them too, along with obviously people in the Black community, Black activists, Latino activists, Native American activists, all joining together, demanding the creation of ethnic studies departments and curriculum. Specifically, again, they said they want to focus on the needs and experience of peoples of color. So that's their demand. Now, again, they've met a lot of resistance. They had long strikes, they'd sit in occupation of buildings. I mean, this is the Vietnam War era, right? So there's a lot of ferment, there's a lot of pushback, there's some violence from the police toward them, there's a lot of back and forth in this, and this goes on for months. Take over 5 months of protests, sit-ins, occupying the buildings. Over 700 student activists were arrested. That's in the campaign at UC Berkeley. Some more images from the protests, in this case, Asian Americans of the Third World Liberation Front, again, striking for ethnic studies. Following these strikes, again, we'll get into this more detail later in the semester, just a brief overview of where the ethnic studies come from for the Asian American experience. But following the strikes, both at UC Berkeley and San Francisco State, both of them reluctantly, actually a lot of pressure and a lot of student effort, both of them formed ethnic studies departments devoted to the demands of the Third World Liberation Front. In this case, Chicano studies, African American or Black studies, Asian American studies, and Native American studies, and those departments are in the process of being formed for the very first time. Other campuses over time gradually begin to add them on, but that's been gradually, oftentimes with more student activism to make that happen. Here's a primary source from that time period, and don't worry, we're not going to read all of this. I just want to show you guys something. The very top of it says that Third World Liberation Front demands the following, and then you see the very first one, right? The funds be allocated to implementation of Third World College. A, Department of Asian Studies, that position staff be set up to develop the Asian Studies Department controlled by Asian people. And you can see going to list the rest of the Black Studies, Chicano, Native American Studies as part of it. And their demands eventually, as you guys know, after a lot of effort, would eventually be met at those specific universities. Yuji Ichioka would go on to teach the first Asian American Studies class at UCLA. And that's a depiction of him addressing students there in our march, demanding for that UCLA to include ethnic studies classes. And there's the two of them much later in life. Sadly, Yuji Ichioka has passed away. I'm not sure whether Emma G has or not. He's passed away. I'd have to look at whether she has or not. Okay, not go too much farther here. This is probably, you guys got quite a bit already, but that's just a little background into the formation of ethnic studies as a discipline. History, of course, has been around for a long time, but ethnic studies as a discipline, that's a relatively new. And even now, by the way, it's new. The state of California, you guys know, has just mandated this for all students, freshmen and sophomore in the state of California, to take at least one course. So you'll see even just recently expansion of this and the timing of this. All right, a few more things before we get to the end of this first lecture. So quick definition of terms race and ethnicity. Let me get a drink. Okay, sorry about that. Okay. By the way, I know sometimes when I get excited, I talk kind of fast. The nice thing is you can pause. You can go back. You can slow it down. In fact, you just pause. You don't have to listen to me for a minute or two. You can just write down what you need as I'm highlighting. So, all right. So race. Now, that gets a little bit, maybe it's simple and complicated, but it is. It's a contentious, debatable term with evolving definitions that range from simple physical traits to a host of assumptions and perceptions that may include culture, ability, and spiritual soul. Now, right off the bat, maybe your ears perk up a little bit when you hear some of those last aspects of definition. That's because it depends who's using that term, what they mean by it. Again, it's kind of an umbrella term. What do you exactly mean by race? Are you talking simply physical traits? Now, most of us, to some degree, maybe agree on some of that. But the last part of it, does that include culture? Does it include ability, spiritual soul? Now, I'd argue all three of those are dangerous. None of those are tied to race. Now, they're tied to ethnicity, absolutely, but not to race. Race is a strictly, I'd argue, biological aspect. And even that gets kind of complicated. So let's take a look. All right, so race. A simple, straightforward definition of race, according to Merriam-Webster, is a category of human beings that share certain distinctive physical traits. It's simply physical, biological attributes. It has nothing to do with the mind. It simply is generalized physical attributes. Now, historically, much more can be added into that, as you guys know. Now, in that case, race becomes more of a sociological judgment and a perception. And that can cut both negatively and positively, oftentimes negatively, frankly, because it can be limiting or oftentimes far worse, racist in these depictions of race. So I'd argue it's much safer to keep race very simple as a biological term and allow ethnicity, which we'll get to here in a minute, to have that larger, broader definition we're talking about. If you get into any simple definition of race, so that also gets kind of complicated because people often are quite complicated. For example, picking like one race in a box as you guys know, it really is kind of reductive. Reductive means artificially limiting, because all of us are to a degree are a mix of a lot of ancestry. So um, as we know more and more, the more DNA testing we do on people, the more we realize that race is actually a very complex phenomenon. That we're all gradations of a wide range of peoples, frankly. Now, maybe on the surface, we appear to more neatly, easily fit into, quote, like a racial box, but the reality is usually much more complicated than the simple kind of binary black, white, Asian, Native American, etc., Polynesian. It's more complicated than that. Okay, especially because, as we know, there can be a very dark conclusion to those kind of simple judgments. Right. Now, ethnicity, now, by the way, if I didn't already, let me highlight that for you guys. I want you guys to write that down. Same thing for ethnicity. So what is ethnicity? Now, ethnicity includes what attributes or identities to which a race may be part of it. Now, ethnicity is not necessarily tied to race. It could include race, but may or may not, frankly. So it's a much bigger, broader definition. But basically means there's a social group that identifies with certain commonalities that could include racial, tribal, cultural, linguistic, religious, cultural origin, etc., and even choice. So that gets much bigger. So when you say ethnic background, that's more of a bigger package than just simply race. Ethnicity is a much broader term. Again, it may or may not include race, frankly. And we'll give you examples of that here that come up a little bit. But those two terms are important for us going forward, both that term race and also ethnicity. So let me give you a little background into this. And again, this will be just a brief introduction before we leave this. But a brief history of the concept of race and ethnicity in the context of Asian American experience in America. So again, we just talked about race being can be a very loaded term. So can ethnicity, and certainly American history bears that out. The United States and the colonies prior to that have a long history of recognizing racial differences and have sought to protect the minority racial group while using, exploiting, excluding, often dehumanizing other racial groups, ethnicities. That's important. You guys got to write that down. So take a minute, pause, write that down. So obviously, just a brief look at African American experience, enslavement, Native American experience of exclusion, removal, violence against them, the Asian American community and their struggles to be recognized fully as human being, struggles for citizenship. It's a long history of the majority group seeing a superficial version of race, maybe in ethnicity as well, and seeking to protect the majority position through exclusion, sometimes violence, exploitation of the minority group, often based on a general negative perception of race and separateness. Yeah. So oftentimes this perception of preferring one's dominant racial group, an ethnic group can include, means that you can look at other racial ethnic groups as somehow fundamentally different and threatening or exploitable. In this case, think of slavery, etc. The treatment of Native Americans. All that is often the case within what's called the settler plantation system of the colonies, which you have a new arriving community that arrives, sets up a colony, and then oftentimes they need labor or groups around them to use, but they don't use them as a fully functioning part of their own society. They again use them or exploit them is oftentimes how this takes place. For example, the Spanish exploiting the native peoples to mine for them. The English forcing Africans who have been enslaved peoples to work for them on free labor, and the abuse system that we know today is of slavery. So Asian Americans, of course, find themselves entering in this racial and ethnic landscape, right? In which Asians often are seen as, and here we pick up right here, as one monolithic group, regardless of national origin, ethnicity, class, religion. And then oftentimes they're fixed in the American mind as backward, submissive, and as inferior. Now again, America is diverse. Now, of course, not Americans saw that, but that would be quite common. So I want you guys to take a minute, write that down by Erica Lee, talking about for many Asians, you get put into that package. When they arrived, you move into this racial categorization of the dominant American society who sees you that way, that does not see you as an individual, does not understand your culture, your background, your value as an equal human being. Instead, fixes you into this subordinate status as this different other. Different physical attributes of Asians are viewed as Americans as immutable. I mean, it's unchangeable expression of racial determinism. I should define that. Racial determinism means you have some trait to your race that's not physical. Well, it could be physical, but in this case, it's attributes of your mind, of who you are, and your genetic race predisposes your mind to work in a certain way. And you can never get out of that because racially, your mind is preset, it's downloaded with a certain outlook in the world. Now, by the way, I think any modern person will reject that thinking out of hand because that's deeply disturbing, as obvious as you can see as men. But that'd be quite common in this era to see that race is not simply a physical attribute, but it's a capability, it's an IQ attribute, it's a viewpoint. So what that means, of course, is they view Asians oftentimes unacceptably foreign, un-American, unassimilable, threatened economically, weakening to the nation by the sheer numbers, and threatening by their Asian beliefs, which are not compatible with the free, democratic, dynamic Western individual culture that America sees as part of its greatness. That is a mouthful. I'll give you guys a minute to go back and look at it. But basically, they're not like us. They can't be like us. So by the way, so you could take a Chinese person, bring them to America, educate them in American school, teach them English fluently, expose them to American culture, American government systems, but in this racial determinist view, they can never become American because intellectually, emotionally, their soul is Chinese. They'll never be the free-thinking, creative, democratic citizen in America. It's not racially possible for them because their mind is preset within, quote, Asian orientation. Now, it goes without saying that this is completely ascientific. It's garbage. I don't even need to mention that, but that is quite common that time period. People even saying that would not view themselves necessarily even racist, saying that see that just simply as a natural phenomena of the human races as they naturally are. Add that the ideas of social scientific racism and social Darwinism, and that just fuels that they are fundamentally non-American. They can't be like this. We're fundamentally a white Protestant culture, and that's part of our genius, and it goes down to our DNA. But they, from Asia, they can never be part of that. Thus, they're a threat. We need to exclude them. Now, obviously, this is garbage. These are quasi-scientific rationales. Quasi means it tries to appear in the guise of science, not science. Now, as a consequence of this, obviously, Asian immigrants are going to face racism, cultural and racial discrimination, sometimes outright violence, exclusion. Because if you really believe this stuff, you wouldn't want to have these people living with you. Various forms of exploitation, forms of segregation, and in general, a little typo there, a general denial of full access to American life. Now, of course, American society is more complex to that. It's not limited just to those. So I don't want to say all Americans thought this way, because thank God not all Americans thought this way. From the majority white culture, for example, looking at the Asian community, and there's always been exceptions to that. So I don't want to give the perception that America was some kind of, I say white America was some kind of racial monolith with these views. There's always been Americans who have strongly pushed back against these dehumanizing views. But I would say that they're quite common, oftentimes common enough that they're in the majority. So it makes it very difficult for the Asian American community, even though despite there's always been a minority of white Americans and African Americans, Latino Americans, others who see the full humanity of the Asian immigrant and even fight for them. Clearly, though, based on what we just talked about, our modern concept of a racially and ethnically pluralistic society and democracy was very, very far from the lived reality of most Americans in that time period. So, idea of the strength of what our multicultural, multiracial, multi-ethnic background brings to the nation. That is much more of a recent shift in America to recognize that strength, that reality that brings to us. Much further in America, back in American history, there's a very strong push to stop that kind of idea. And not, as you guys know, not all that opposition's gone now. Even now, so there's some of that. There's some of that nativism. There's some of that preference for one's own racial, ethnic group that's not gone away. I hope today in 2022 that those are more fringe movements. But tragically, Charlottesville and other things, there's some dark stuff that's going on. You go on the internet, and you're going to find some individuals in a very dark place that have not left 1850s America and its fear and rejection of Asians. Okay, and I think we're going to stop this lecture right here. We're almost done with the first lecture. There's a little bit left, but that'll be for part 2. So we're going to stop this right here. So that's enough for our first go around. We'll get to part 2 of the next lecture, and I'll see you when that starts after this. Take care, everybody.